In the late 1990s, trucks began unloading thousands of tons of orange peel and pulp inside a protected area in Costa Rica. To a lot of people, it looked like an environmental crime. A juice company was dumping waste on protected land. The piles were huge, sticky, bright orange, rotting in the tropical heat. And then the whole project was dragged into court and shut down. Most people assumed it had failed. But about 16 years later, researchers went back to find the site. At first, they thought they had the wrong location, because the barren field was gone. In its place was a forest, and the data suggested that the orange waste had helped build it. But before we go any further, one detail really matters. This was not untouched rainforest. The orange waste was spread over a heavily degraded former cattle pasture inside Costa Rica's Guanacaste Conservation Area, land that had been stripped down by years of grazing and invasive grasses. That detail changes everything. Costa Rica is famous for its biodiversity, and the Guanacaste Conservation Area is one of the country's most important restoration projects. But not all protected land looks like a postcard. Some of it had been damaged long before it was protected. Large areas had been cleared for cattle ranching. The trees were gone. The soil was exhausted. Thick pasture grasses dominated the land and made it hard for native forests to come back. That was the problem facing conservation biologists Daniel Jansen and Winnie Hallwalks, a husband and wife team who had spent decades working to restore and protect ecosystems in Costa Rica. They weren't just trying to save forests, they were trying to figure out how to bring forests back. And that is usually expensive. Normally, restoration means planting seedlings, managing weeds, protecting young trees, and waiting years to see if anything survives. But Jansen and Hallwalks saw a strange opportunity in a nearby industry. Because in 1996, an orange juice company called Del Oro had a problem of its own. Every day, juicing oranges created mountains of leftover peel and pulp. Disposing of all that organic waste cost money. So Jansen and Hallwalks proposed something unusual. What if that waste could be used to heal damaged land? The idea was surprisingly simple. Spread the orange waste over a degraded pasture and let it do what forest litter does naturally. Break down, add organic matter to the soil, and help suppress the aggressive grasses that were blocking. Forest regeneration. In other words, instead of treating the leftover orange material as garbage, treat it like a restoration tool. Del Oro agreed to take part. In exchange for being allowed to deposit orange waste on a degraded 3-hectare site, about 7 acres, the company also agreed to donate land to the conservation effort. Over time, roughly 1,000 truckloads, estimated at about 12,000 metric tons, were dumped onto that former pasture. That number sounds outrageous, and visually it was. Imagine truck after truck unloading orange peel and pulp until the ground disappears under a thick, wet blanket of citrus waste. It did not look elegant. It did not look scientific. It looked messy, but underneath that mess was a real ecological idea. The waste would decompose in the tropical heat and rain. That decomposition would help enrich the soil, and just as important, the thick layer of pulp and peel could smother the invasive pasture grasses that were dominating the site. If the grasses weakened, native plants would finally get a chance. That was the gamble. And for a brief moment, it seemed like it might work. Then the backlash started. To critics, this didn't look like restoration. It looked like dumping. A rival juice company, Tico Fruit, challenged the arrangement in court. The arguments were serious. Could a protected area legally be used this way, even if the land was already degraded? Did the deal give Del Oro an unfair advantage? And if this was allowed once, would it open the door for other companies to claim their own waste was good for nature? Those concerns reached Costa Rica's Supreme Court, and in 1998, the court halted the project. By then, about 12,000 metric tons of orange waste had already been deposited. No more could be added. The experiment was over, or at least that's what people thought. The site was left alone. No one came back with more trucks. No one turned it into a public success story. And over time, the whole thing faded from view. The Orange Waste Project became one of those half-forgotten environmental stories people argue about years later. Some assumed it had been a disaster. Others believed it had worked. But for a long time, nobody had gone back and properly checked. About 16 years later, a team of researchers became curious about the old experiment. One of them was Timothy Troyer, who wanted to know whether this strange idea had actually changed the landscape. So the team went to Costa Rica to find the site. And that turned out to be harder than expected, because the maps were old. The area had changed, and when they reached the location, they were confused. They were expecting something obvious, maybe a clearing or disturbed ground, or some lingering sign of the old dump site. Instead, they found dense vegetation, trees, shade, forest structure. At first, they thought they must be in the wrong place. Then they spotted something in the greenery, an old yellow marker, almost swallowed by plants. It matched the original markers used to identify the site years earlier. They had found it. This was the place the former orange waste dump had become a forest. And not just a little greener, dramatically different. The kind of difference you can see with your eyes. But scientists still needed to measure, so they did. The researchers compared the old orange waste site to a nearby untreated area with similar starting conditions. They laid out transects, measured trees, analyzed soil, and compared plant growth on both sides. This mattered, because appearances alone can be misleading. Maybe the whole area had recovered. Maybe the orange waste had nothing to do with it. That's why the comparison site was so important, and the results were hard to ignore. The former orange waste plot had 176% more above-ground biomass than the nearby untreated land. Its canopy was denser. Its soil was richer. It had far more tree growth and much greater ecological recovery than the control area across the road. In the treated plot, the open cattle pasture had been replaced by a much more developed forest structure. In the untreated plot, recovery lagged behind. The researchers also found greater tree species richness at the orange waste site, suggesting that the changes weren't just cosmetic. The land wasn't simply growing more plants. It was moving further along the path back toward forest. That is a huge deal, because tropical forest restoration is usually slow, labor-intensive, and expensive. Here, a material considered a disposal problem appeared to accelerate regeneration on degraded land at very low cost. Not free, the trucking still mattered, but far cheaper than many conventional restoration methods. And perhaps the most striking part of the whole story is this. By the time the researchers returned, there was no giant orange peel pile left to see. Nature had already done what nature does. It had taken the mess, broken it down, and folded it into the ecosystem. So why did this work? Not because oranges are magical, and not because you can dump food waste anywhere and expect a forest. It worked because several specific conditions lined up. First, the site was already badly degraded. This was not healthy rainforest being covered in waste. It was former cattle pasture struggling to recover. Second, the material was organic plant matter, orange peel and pulp, not mixed trash. Third, the climate helped. Costa Rica's warm, wet conditions speed up decomposition and plant growth. And fourth, the orange waste likely did two things at once. It added a large pulse of organic matter to depleted soil, and it buried the invasive grasses that had been outcompeting native plants. That combination gave forest regeneration a chance to break through. So this story is not a blueprint for careless dumping. It's a case study in targeted restoration. Right material, right place,
right conditions.
That distinction matters, because in the wrong setting, dumping organic waste could absolutely create serious environmental problems. Science isn't about copying one result everywhere. It's about understanding why something worked. What I love about this story is that it feels almost too strange to be real. A conservation team looks at a dead pasture and sees possibility. A juice company looks at mountains of leftovers and sees a disposal problem. For a brief moment, those two problems overlap. Then the experiment is attacked, shut down, and forgotten. And years later, people come back expecting a cautionary tale and find a forest. There's something deeply human in that, because most restoration stories are slow, quiet, easy to miss. No dramatic before and after happens overnight. But this one left behind a visual answer. People once saw a disgusting pile of rotting orange waste. 16 years later, they saw trees. The orange waste forest is a reminder that some of the best environmental ideas don't look impressive at the beginning. Sometimes they look wrong. Sometimes they look ugly. Sometimes they look like failure. But under the right conditions, what seems like waste can become a resource. And what looks like a ruined field can become habitat again. Not everywhere, not automatically, and not without careful science. But this one forgotten experiment in Costa Rica showed something remarkable. A low-value byproduct from agriculture may have helped jumpstart the return of a tropical forest. So the next time you peel an orange, think about that, because in the right place, even something discarded can help bring a landscape back to life. If you want more stories where science, nature, and human creativity collide, subscribe